Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. We're hearing a lot of strong language being tossed about around condemning the attacks on Ukraine, and we're hearing a lot of requests for help and aid from the people and the president of Ukraine. At the same time, we're hearing denials and accusations coming from Russia saying that it is the Western people that are being the aggressors, and that the Western people are developing biological and chemical agents to be used as weapons, and not Russia. It's going to become a topic in the UN Security Council, as they are going to talk about that sort of thing. You'll hear statements being made about that sort of thing, and who is actually breaking the convention and the agreements that were made internationally around the ban of such kind of weapons. It is also going to be discussed on the UN floor about how Russia is targeting civilian targets, such as maternity hospitals and hospitals that have children. That they're using cluster weapons that cause more collateral damage to civilian people, and how the civilians in the Ukraine are actually more at risk and are suffering greater than anyone else because of the aggression that's being waged. The United States, of course, makes statements through the UN and also through President Biden and the White House. And in some of those statements, he's adamant that he does not want to start World War III, and he does not want to take direct aggression against Russia. But is the pressure mounting that he might actually have to do certain things in order to slow the progress of the Russian advances into Ukraine? We also hear statements from the United Nations about Poland wanting to deliver jets and airborne military aid to Ukraine to help stop the missile strikes and the bombings that are happening. So the thought, of course, from the United States is that those sort of weapons are only aid in causing World War III. So there's a lot happening, and when we get to the White House statements, we'll hear about consequences that will happen against China for wanting to aid Russia, the Russian government, through their time of attack against Ukraine. We also have some other statements from the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who strongly condemns the unlawful use of force and aggression by Russia against the territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. The leaders discussed the impacts and the conflicts across the region, including humanitarian and economic disruption and increased security concerns. Prime Minister Trudeau thanked Prime Minister Pashinyan for receiving the Canadian ambassador to Germany and Special Envoy to European Union and Europe, Stéphane Dion, during the visit to Armenia. And for more statements from the Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau concluded his successful trip to Europe, including visits to United Kingdom, Latvia, Germany, and Poland. The Prime Minister met with leaders and allies to continue to coordinate a response against the unprovoked, unjustified aggression against Ukraine. The Prime Minister conveyed Canada's support to Europe partners as they seek to address the emerging security and humanitarian challenges in the region. Canada, alongside Europe, is supporting Ukraine by military aid, imposing significant sanctions on Russia, addressing the emerging humanitarian crisis in the region. Canada is also increasing military presence in Europe to support NATO allies and enforce NATO's eastern flank. While in Poland, the Prime Minister announced additional measures and investments in continuing supporting Russia amidst Russia's ongoing aggression, including matching additional $20 million in donations from Canadians to the Canadian Red Cross, for a total of $30 million in government contributions to immediate ongoing efforts of relief, allocating $50 million from Canada's $100 million contribution for humanitarian aid in the region to the World Food Program, investing $117 million to implement Canada's new immigration measures for those who are fleeing the war in Ukraine. So there's a lot happening with Ukraine and what Russia is actually doing as they continue their attacks. Cities are under attack, and President Zelensky of the Ukraine is claiming he will hold on. So we'll have to watch and see what more aid comes from global support to the people of Ukraine in their time of need.
We're going to continue to stand together with our allies in Europe and send unmistakable message. We'll defend every single inch of NATO territory with the full might of the united and galvanized NATO. We will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, something we must strive to prevent. But we already know Putin's war against Ukraine will never be a victory. He hoped to dominate Ukraine without a fight. He failed. He hoped to fracture European resolve. He failed. He hoped to weaken the transatlantic alliance. He failed. He hoped to split apart American democracies in terms of our positions. He failed. The American people are united, the world is united, and we stand with the people of Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you very much for coming. Ukraine is on fire. The country is being decimated before the eyes of the world. The impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Countless innocent people, including women and children, have been killed. After being hit by Russian forces, roads, airports, and schools lie in ruins. According to the World Health Organization, at least 24 health facilities have suffered attacks. Hundreds of thousands of people are without water or electricity. And with each passing hour, two things are increasingly clear. First, it keeps getting worse. Second, whatever the outcome, this war will have no winners, only losers. The United Nations and the humanitarian partners are working to ensure safe passage from besieged areas and to provide aid where security permits. More than 600,000 people have received some form of aid. As millions of people in Ukraine face hunger and dwindling supplies of water and medicine, I'm announcing today that the United Nations will allocate a further $40 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to ramp up vital assistance to reach the most vulnerable as we wait for the nations to come. This funding will help get critical supplies of food, water, medicines, and other life-saving aid into the country, as well as provide cash assistance to the needy. But the avenues in and out of encircled cities are more precarious by the day. And I underscore the crucial importance of respecting international humanitarian law. At least 1.9 million people are displaced inside the country, and growing numbers are escaping across borders. I'm deeply grateful for the solidarity of Ukraine's neighbors and other host countries who have taken in more than 2.8 million refugees in the past 2 weeks. The vast majority of those making the treacherous journey are women and children who are increasingly vulnerable. For predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. And women and children are the targets. They need safety and support every step of the way. I will continue to highlight the desperate plight of the people of Ukraine as I am doing again today. Yet, there is another dimension of this conflict that gets obscured. This war goes far beyond Ukraine. It is also an assault on the world's most vulnerable people and countries. While war reigns over Ukraine, a sword of Damocles hangs over the global economy, especially in the developing world. Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now, their breadbasket is being bombed. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and about 30% of the world's wheat. Ukraine alone provides more than half of the world's food program's wheat supply. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted, and the costs and delays of transportation of imported goods, when available, are at record levels. And all of this is hitting the poorest, the hardest, and planting the seeds for political instability and unrest around the globe. Grain prices have already exceeded those at the start of the Arab Spring and the food riots of 2007-2008. The FAO's Global Food Prices Index is at its highest level ever. 45 African and least developed countries import at least 1/3 of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. 18 of those countries import at least 50%. This includes countries like Burkina Faso, Egypt, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. We must do everything possible to avert a hurricane of hunger and the meltdown of the global food system. In addition, we are seeing clear evidence of this war draining resources and attention from other trouble spots in desperate need. I renew my appeal for countries to find creative ways to finance increased humanitarian and development recovery needs worldwide and to give generously and to immediately release pledged funds. My plea to leaders is to resist the temptation of increasing military budget at the expense of official development assistance and climate action. In a word, developing countries are getting pummeled. They face a cascade of crises beyond the Ukraine war. We cannot forget COVID and the impacts of climate change, in particular drought. Against the backdrop of these immense interconnected challenges, I'm announcing today the establishing of a global crisis response group on food, energy and finance in the UN Secretariat. I've also asked the Deputy Secretary General to lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee these efforts. And in the coming days, we will be consulting with member states willing to champion the actions needed to carry forward the global emergency response that will be required for this looming crisis. Make no mistake, everyday people, especially women and children, will bear the brunt of this unfolding tragedy. The war also shows how the global addiction to fossil fuels is placing energy security, climate action, and the entire global economy at the mercy of geopolitics. Finally, further escalation of the war, whether by accident or design, threatens all of humanity. Raising the alert of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility. The security and safety of nuclear facilities must also be preserved. It's time to stop the horror unleashed on the people of Ukraine and get on the path of diplomacy and peace. I've been in close contact with a number of countries, including China, France, Germany, India, Israel, and Turkey, on mediation efforts to bring an end to this war. The appeals for peace must be heard. This tragedy must stop. It's never too late for diplomacy and dialogue. We need an immediate cessation of hostilities and serious negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We need peace. Peace for the people of Ukraine. Peace for the world. We need peace now. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. All right, first question, Margaret Boucher.
Thank you, Secretary General. Do you support Ukraine's calls for a no-fly zone?
That is a matter that, as you know, has been analyzed by a number of countries that considered that possibility as a risk of escalation that could create a global conflict. And it is based on that analysis that I think we need to be prudent, even if I understand the dramatic appeal of the Ukrainian government.
Alan Bulgati.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Donetsk authorities reported today that Ukrainian side hit at the heart of the city of Donetsk by missile .U, and the warhead of this missile was filled by the cluster munitions. I was following the Security Council, but I haven't heard anything about this. Is the UN aware of this incident?
I've seen the news about this incident, and I have to say that our position is very clear. Any attack on civilians or civilian infrastructure is regrettable if accidental and condemnable if done on purpose. But let's be clear, the overwhelming majority of civilian casualties and the overwhelming majority of civilian infrastructure destructed was done in the context of the war by the Russian forces.
Time for one more.
Thank you, Secretary General. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You talk about mediation, but the talks have adjourned for the day. Is there anything you have done or will do, and have you reached out to Russia's President Putin? Thank you.
Yes, we are doing our best. I've talked with a number of leaders that are in permanent contact with President Putin, and of course we consider that it's absolutely essential for an additional effort, to make the Russian Federation understand that this war is becoming an absolute nightmare, and to create the conditions for the war to be stopped and for serious negotiations to be put in place. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to have briefed the United Nations Security Council in my capacity of a Chairperson-in-Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Both the United Nations and the OSCE work to maintain international peace and security and safeguard the respect for international law, including the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is why they both condemned in the strongest terms the military aggression of Russia on Ukraine, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, shelling hospitals and schools is not only inhuman, it is nothing but a crime under international law. The OSCE Polish chairmanship is now facing a completely different reality than a month ago. The war in Ukraine has dominated its agenda almost completely. Russian aggression shakes the very foundation of the OSCE. We see Russia defy its primary responsibility to act as a guardian of international peace and security, both as a member of OSCE as well as the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Instead, it chooses to act as an aggressor. This long-planned military attack, with the participation of another state, Belarus, is unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal. Such a flagrant breach of OSCE principles and commitments poses questions about stability of the rules-based order. Still, we believe OSCE is able to keep the states talking in good times and bad. Poland is convinced it is in the best interest of the organization and its participating states to work on proper modus operandi to fulfill OSCE's mandate. Right now, the primary focus of OSCE work in Ukraine will be to help avert humanitarian crisis and create the conditions for assistance and evacuation. OSCE stands ready to continue its cooperation with the United Nations. We have established close coordination with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, International Organization for Migration, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The OSCE welcomes any genuine effort that contributes to stopping the ongoing hostilities and can lead to finding a sustainable, peaceful solution. With that said, talk must be accompanied by actions. I reiterate the joint call I made with OSCE Secretary General Helga Schmidt on the very first day of the Russian aggression for the immediate cessation of all military activities. We call on Russia to stop the deplorable acts. We call on Russia to stop shelling civilians while attempts of evacuation. We call on Russia to stop shelling and dropping bombs on homes, hospitals, and streets full of innocent people, most of whom are children and women. We call on Russia to honor its international obligations and commitments. Any sustainable political solution must fully respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Finally, we call on Russia to engage in a meaningful and substantial dialogue to seek a peaceful solution to the current crisis. The door to diplomacy is still open. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Rao. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You have accommodated so many refugees. At what point is that a problem for Poland? How many can you take in, and what do you need to do that? Thank you.
Ma'am, I must say that we used to host 1.5 million people before this crisis. So the Ukrainians who visited us and who decided to stay with us were living, working, studying, and learning in Poland. Since the beginning of aggression, we have received 1.6 million Ukrainians. The overwhelming majority of them are in touch with their friends and relatives who already live in Poland. But the Polish government is assisting the help, spontaneous support of Polish society that is being extended to them. So we have just adopted the Bill of Law that gives all the privileges that we, the Polish citizens, enjoy in respect of healthcare, opportunities to learn and study in Polish schools and Polish universities, also the access to labor market, and also the opportunity to take part in our economic life, for example, by launching their own businesses in Poland. So all that indicates that we are ready to host a considerable number of our Ukrainian neighbors who are in need. But certainly no country can do anything like that on its own. So let me just tell you that when Europe went through the immigration crisis in 2015, the continent as a whole received less than 1 million immigrants. Now in Poland alone, we have already 1.6 million refugees of war. And think about other neighboring countries which accepted a smaller portion, but still a very considerable of this influx. So it's more than obvious that, as I said, there is no country in the world that can handle this kind of humanitarian crisis on its own.
Thank you. We want more questions from the Voice of America. Thank you. Hello, Mr. Minister. I'm Margaret Bashir with the Voice of America. In your national capacity, I'd like to ask you, the United States has expressed objections to Poland transferring its MiG jets to Ukraine. Ukraine is still asking for them. Have you been in touch with your Ukrainian counterpart to try and find a workaround to still deliver these jets? Is this still a possibility?
I'm in touch with our American counterparts, with our NATO and European Union counterparts, and of course with the Ukrainian ones. As far as your question is concerned, I can only say that this kind of decision has to be made by the NATO alliance as a whole, but not one member state, because the impact of this kind of decision is going to affect the alliance as a whole. So there is no one single NATO member who could make this decision for the rest of the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.
The 8,991st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Madam President, the war in Ukraine is now in its third week. Fighting continues unabated. The Russian armed forces are pursuing their offensive operations and laying siege to several cities in the south, east, and north of the country. A large concentration of Russian forces is reportedly massed along several approaches to the capital, Kyiv. The situation is particularly alarming in Mariupol, Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv, where there is shelling of residential areas and civilian infrastructure, resulting in an increasing number of civilians killed and injured. The utter devastation being visited on these cities is horrific. The numbers bear out the conclusion that civilians are paying the highest price for the conflict. As of 11 March, The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded a total of 1,546 civilian casualties, including 564 killed and 982 injured since the start of the invasion on 24 February. OHCHR believes the real casualty figures are likely considerably higher, as information from locations whose intense hostilities are ongoing has been delayed and reports are still pending corroboration. Most of the recorded civilian casualties, which include children, have been caused by explosive weapons with a wide impact area, including heavy artillery and multi-launch rocket systems and missile and airstrikes. OHCHR has received credible reports of Russian forces using cluster munitions, including in populated areas. Indiscriminate attacks, including those using cluster munitions, which are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Direct attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as so-called area bombardment in towns and villages, are also prohibited under international law and may amount to war crimes. As of 10 March, the World Health Organization has verified 26 attacks on health facilities, health workers, and ambulances, causing 12 deaths and 34 injuries. This includes the bombing of the Mariupol Maternity Hospital on 9 March. We condemn such attacks without reservation. They cause not only death and destruction, they also deprive people of urgently needed care and endanger more lives. We cannot emphasize it enough. The targeting of civilians, of residential buildings, hospitals, schools, kindergartens is inexcusable and intolerable. All alleged violations of international human law must be investigated and those found responsible held accountable. Madam President, millions of people in Ukraine need urgent assistance. This includes 2 million internally displaced people. We are scaling up humanitarian aid in areas where security permits. More than 500,000 people are now receiving assistance, including life-saving food, shelter, blankets, and medical supplies. The United Nations and our partners have developed operational plans to meet humanitarian needs where they are most acute. This work needs funding. Over $1.5 billion was pledged to the appeals last week. We are grateful for this generosity and encourage donors to release the funding quickly. Madam President, it is critical to urgently achieve a cessation of hostilities, to allow for the safe passage of civilians from besieged areas, and to ensure that life-saving humanitarian supplies can reach those who remain. On 9 March, over 51,000 people were reportedly evacuated through 5 out of 6 agreed-upon safe passages. These safe passages must continue. They should be implemented with clear principles and modalities. Civilians should be duly and timely informed of the possibility to leave the concerned areas and on a voluntary basis and in the direction they choose. To expand life-saving assistance and services to those most in need, humanitarian actors must also have safe, rapid, unimpeded, and sustained access to all areas. We commend the humanitarian actors on the ground who are staying and delivering in a highly volatile situation. Madam President, the number of refugees from Ukraine has reached 2.5 million people. These numbers continue increasing by the day. We also commend the countries that have kept their borders open to welcome and support refugees. All people fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals, need access to safety and protection in line with the principle of non-refoulement and without any form of discrimination. Madam President, the need for negotiations to stop the war in Ukraine could not be more urgent. We note the 3 rounds of talks held thus far between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. We call for such efforts to intensify, including to further secure humanitarian and ceasefire arrangements as a matter of priority. We urge the sides to build on their contacts, such as the meeting yesterday between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and the Russian Federation in Antalya, Turkey. The logic of dialogue and diplomacy must prevail over the logic of war. The Secretary General is grateful to the many member states working in pursuit of a diplomatic solution to this dangerous conflict. He is in regular contact with regional and other leaders, and his good offices remain available. Madam President, let me affirm the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. As the war grinds on, there's already much reflection about its implications beyond the tragedy it represents for Ukraine. We increasingly hear the use of terms such as turning point, defining moment, end of multilateralism. I believe this is not an exaggeration. Indeed, some consequences are already being felt economically and politically. Perhaps most alarming are the risks the violence poses to the global framework for peace and security. We must do everything we can to find a solution and put an end to this war. And we must do it now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank Council members for the opportunity to brief you this morning. I am aware of reports that certain public health facilities are in areas impacted by armed conflict, putting the safety of those facilities at risk. I appeal to all parties in this conflict to ensure the safety of all such facilities in Ukraine. I am aware of media reports regarding allegations of biological weapons programs. The United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons programs. That is largely thanks to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxic weapons. The Russian Federation and Ukraine are both states parties to the convention. In addition, the Russian Federation is a depository government under the convention. All states parties to the convention have undertaken never in any circumstances to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire or retain biological weapons. Biological weapons have been outlawed since the BWC entered into force in 1975. A total of 183 states have now joined the convention, and biological weapons are universally seen as being abhorrent and illegitimate. The BWC lacks a multilateral verification mechanism overseen by an independent organization, such as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Therefore, assessing compliance with its obligations is a task for its states parties. Madam President, despite the lack of an international verification regime, the Biological Weapons Convention does, however, contain several measures to which concerned states parties can have recourse in order to address situations in which states parties have concerns or suspicions about the activities of their peers. For example, Article 5 of the Convention states that, and I quote, "The states parties to this convention undertake to consult one another and to cooperate in solving any problems which may arise in relation to the objective of or in the application of the provisions of this convention." End of quote. Within the framework of Article 5, states parties have established an annual exchange of information based upon the submission of confidence-building measures. states parties must declare information about relevant facilities and activities on their territory in order to prevent or reduce the occurrence of ambiguous doubts and suspicions between them. The Russian Federation and Ukraine both participate annually in the confidence-building measures. The annual reports submitted by the Russian Federation and Ukraine are available to all BWC states parties for the purposes of transparency and reassurance. In addition, and also within the framework of Article 5 of the Convention, states parties have developed procedures for clarifying ambiguous and unresolved matters, including the possible convening of a formal consultative meeting to consider such matters. Article 6 of the Convention states that, and I quote, "Any state party to this Convention which finds that any other state party is acting in breach of obligations deriving from the provisions of the Convention may lodge a complaint with the Security Council. If agreed by the Security Council, an investigation on the basis of the complaint received could be initiated. Article 6 of the Convention has never been activated." While these provisions have not been regularly used, they are nonetheless internationally agreed procedures that are available to be used to diffuse tensions and to address and resolve any concerns relating to compliance with obligations under the BWC in a multilateral setting. I would therefore encourage BWC states parties to consider making use of the available procedures for consultation and cooperation in order to resolve these issues. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, situations such as this demonstrate the need to strengthen the BWC, to operationalize it, and to institutionalize it. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to encourage its states parties to come to the Convention's 9th Review Conference, scheduled to take place in Geneva later in 2022, committed to a series of overhaul of the Convention to ensure it is properly equipped and resourced to deal with the challenges ahead. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, to conclude my statement, I would like to take this opportunity to address the worrying issue of the safety and security of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. An accident involving the nuclear facilities in Ukraine could have severe consequences for public health and environment, and all steps must be taken to avoid it. The possibility of an accident caused by failure to a reactor's power supply or the inability to provide regular maintenance is growing by the day. The forces in effective control of nuclear power plants in Ukraine must ensure their safe and secure operation. I am extremely concerned that 4 of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA's, 7 pillars of the safe and secure operations of facilities are reportedly not being implemented at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. Communications must be fully restored, and operating staff must be allowed to properly carry out their duties and to do so free of undue pressure. I would like to echo the Secretary General's support for IAEA Director General Grossi's efforts to develop a framework to ensure the safety and security of Ukraine's facilities, and welcome the constructive meetings he held in Turkey on 10th of March with the foreign ministers of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I thank you very much for your attention.
After the Rome meeting, since the war began, has China provided any military or economic aid to Russia or expressed any specific intentions to do so?
I'm not in a position to confirm or detail any intelligence from here at this point in time.
Okay. Moving on to the Russia-Ukraine talks. What does the U.S. see that would be a sign for optimism that some kind of ceasefire could be reached? In which carrots, in which sticks do you think Putin is most responding to, if that's the case?
Sure.
Most likely to respond.
Sure. Well, as you've heard us say in the past, we certainly will continue to support the Ukrainian participation in these talks and conversations as long as they choose to continue to participate in them, of course. And we are trying to boost them by providing a range of not just economic and humanitarian assistance, but military assistance that we believe strengthens their positions in these talks. Our view continues to be that despite words that are said in these talks or coming out of these talks, diplomacy requires engaging in good faith to de-escalate. And what we're really looking for is evidence of that. And we're not seeing any evidence at this point that President Putin is doing anything to stop the onslaught or de-escalate. But that is really what we would be looking for. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. To follow up on the Rome meeting, what are the consequences for China if they do aid Russia?
Well, I'm not going to get into specific consequences. I think what we have conveyed and what was conveyed by our national security advisor in this meeting is that should they provide military or other assistance that, of course, violates sanctions or supports the war effort, that there will be significant consequences. But in terms of what those specifics look like, we would coordinate with our partners and allies to make that determination.
Okay. But Jake Sullivan certainly communicated that there would be consequences.
Yes, as we have also said publicly a number of times.
Okay, and then is there anything you can share about the president's potential meeting, potential trip to Europe in the next couple weeks, who he might be meeting with, and really what the point would be of going to Europe?
Sure. Well, we are, of course, closely engaged with our NATO partners and European allies, as you've heard us say a number of times, about the next steps in diplomacy, whether that's providing additional humanitarian or security assistance or the mechanics for future conversations. But there's not been any final decision about a trip, so I don't have anything to preview about what that would look like if you were to take a trip.
Thanks, Jen.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The president said back in February that the U.S. would respond forcefully if Americans were targeted in Ukraine. Brent Renaud was killed over the weekend. One of my colleagues was injured today. We're still waiting to hear if he's okay. So what is that response going to look like?
Well, let me first say, your colleague Benjamin Hall, I know there's not final reports yet, or we would wait for your news organization to confirm those, but our thoughts, the president's thoughts, our administration's thoughts are with him, his family, and all of you at Fox News as well. In terms of specific actions, I think you have seen the president lead the world in putting in place consequences, putting in place repercussions and steps in response to the actions of Russia, the brutal actions that have certainly impacted Ukrainian people and now have certainly impacted some Americans. But in terms of next steps or what the next consequence would be, I don't have anything to preview for you at this point in time.
But we've seen the president been so far unwilling to draw a red line on the kinds of atrocities that we're going to watch from the sidelines. I mean, we've seen maternity wards being bombed, illegal weapons being used, pediatric hospitals being targeted. President Obama drew the red line for Syria at chemical weapons. So is there any thought process about what we're willing to watch happen before
Well, Jackie, I think it's important to reiterate as often as we can that what we're seeing is horrific, what we're seeing is barbaric, and the steps that the president has taken and led the world in taking have essentially led the Russian financial system to be on the brink of collapse. We have provided more military assistance to the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government than any other country in the world, and more historic assistance than any other year to Ukraine in history. And we're doing that so that we can support them in this difficult moment. So I would say that at this moment in time, we have been hardly on the sidelines. We have been leading this effort around the world to respond to every step and every escalatory step that President Putin and the Russians are taking.
Isn't there a concern that if we don't draw the line at something like chemical weapons, that it'll make it easier for malign actors to use them in the future because they'll just go unpunished?
Well, Jackie, I think that you heard the president say on Friday that there would be severe consequences and the world would respond if they were to use chemical weapons. And what we have been doing over the course of the last several weeks, if not months, is providing as much information to the global community, to the media, and to others about what to expect. And when you have President Putin suggesting and Russian officials suggesting that the United States and Ukrainians are the ones who are working on a chemical weapons program, it's clear that this is a pattern that we have seen in the past of them trying to set up a predicate for their own actions.
But what does What does that end up looking like if the world responds? Because so far we've heard the president talk a lot about what the U.S. is not going to do in terms of, not wanting to trigger war with a nuclear power. But do we believe that Putin is, a rational kind of person who, would pay attention to something like that? I mean, he didn't need provocation to, invade Ukraine. Why wouldn't we think that he would just create a pretext that is fabricated for something like that?
We do. That's why we've talked about it. And I think, Jackie, what's important here is and then I'm just going to move on to get to more people, is that for any president, you have to weigh how you can lead the world, how you can make very clear that actions are horrific, that they are not acceptable, they're not aligned with global norms, while also thinking about our own national security interests. And starting World War III is certainly not in our national security interests. Putting U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine to fight a war with Russia is not in our national security interests. Go ahead.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.